please put your hands together to help me welcome Wisniewski Otero to talk about justice.
Hi, good morning. So it's a big word. I write it really big. Justice is something that I think we're all trying to grapple with and understand ourselves. And I just want you mentally to maybe take some time to think what kind of image comes to mind when you see that word. What is invoked in your brain when you hear the term justice? Because a lot of times, like Diana mentioned, we just say it and we don't really think about it. Well, as probably a lot of Creative Morning speakers do, I decided I'll just Google image the word and see what images come to me through the internet. And 9 times out of 10, what you get is this image, Lady Justice. So it's symbolizing the weighing of evidence and impartiality. And then maybe like the other 10% of the time, what you get is this, the true social justice warriors. The challenge, though, is that neither of those things are entirely relatable. Hopefully, none of us will have to enter into a courtroom. I really hope not. And most of us, unfortunately, we won't become superheroes. Sorry. And really, when we, what's really very interesting is that actually in 2018, Merriam-Webster declared justice to be their word of the year. So this was actually the most looked up term in their dictionary. And so it shows that actually around the world, people are trying to find meaning in the word justice. Well, I actually put up the definition here. I'm going to ask someone in the audience in the front row to read it out to me, to the audience.
The maintenance or administration of what is just essential, especially by the impartial adjustment of conflicting claims or the assignment of merited rewards or punishment.
Wow, is that exciting? Is that what you think of? Is that sparking your passion? Probably not. And the reason I think is because when we think of the word justice, actually what we're thinking of is more community understanding of social justice. And so maybe some words that came to your mind, and this is actually based on some words that came to 800 people's minds that we did, I'll tell you later. Maybe you think more of these kinds of things here. And certainly, I think even if we have a hard time defining justice, all of us definitely know when we have experienced an injustice. We know it in our bones. And there's an interesting video I want to show you. So there was a study done a couple years ago with 2 monkeys. And basically, and you'll see in the video, the monkeys are given the same task, which is to give pebbles to a scientist. However, one monkey is given a tasty grape and in reward, and the other monkey is given a tasteless cucumber. And I want to show you what happens. Diana, I will need your help on this.
On the video.
Do I click?
Yeah.
Grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task.
Okay. So what this says, what's interesting about this video, by the way, is that those monkeys at first were both given cucumbers and both were fine to do it. And it's only once the other monkey started getting the grape that suddenly the cucumber became disgusting, an offense, insulting. So actually our sense of justice is not just about what we receive, but what we receive in relation to others. And this actually evolved from our biology. So actually there's many studies that have now shown that our sense of justice and fairness comes from our primate origins and the need to cooperate in order to survive. And actually, inequality can be very destabilizing for societies. And I want to show you some figures. So this is levels of inequality in different countries. Why would I have this random mix of countries? Well, actually, Hong Kong stands at 53.7, and these are the only countries in the world that stand above Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is 9th in the world in inequality, and number 1 in terms of inequality in any developed country. And this is where Hong Kong stands in relation to some other countries. You can see, for example, Sweden is about half. What does this figure mean? It's called the Gini coefficient. So basically, say all of us have 100 Hong Kong dollars in our pockets, same amount. That would be a Gini coefficient of 0. But say I have all your money in my pocket, that would be a Gini coefficient of 1. So Hong Kong is really, really, really in a danger zone. Now, we can, of course, look at biology, we can look at statistics for our understanding of justice, but obviously, how we define justice is so much related to our own personal experiences. And this became very clear to me around 3 years ago, which is when I started to think about resolve. And basically, I used to work in I used to do a very typical kind of human rights job. What I have here is an image of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I think something that surprised us a couple of years ago is that one by one, voters in different countries around the world began to elect politicians that had an agenda that was deliberately against human rights and using language that targeted minorities, using bellicose language. And I think, for us, it really took us by surprise. And for a while, I was working in human rights. What that means for my experience was basically preparing a lot of documentation, a lot of reports where the footnote takes up more part of the page than the actual text. But working with people who were extremely dedicated, very specialized, it felt, very professional, very important. And yet it was an echo chamber in a lot of ways. And, for us, it was quite frightening to see this kind of language coming about. And it really made me feel, how could we be so blindsided? How could we not have seen this coming? And I started to really question my own understanding of justice and seeing how differently maybe people view the world to me. And it made me question my own assumptions a little bit, but also discover some of my own truths. And there was a lot of memories and experiences in my life that I took for granted or maybe were latent in me. But over time and with reflection, I realized that they were sending me on a certain trajectory. And actually, these were all tiny drops of water that ended up forming my own river of life until I could kind of feel that current. And what I thought I'd do today is and I don't normally go this personal, but I thought I would start off by sharing it with you how my own understanding of justice evolved over time because of my own experiences. And all of you probably could do a similar reflection, and I would encourage you to. So for me, the starting point is that justice is about community. And so I'll show you some pictures from my own family album. So I grew up in a small town in the south of North Carolina in the 80s. My mother was an immigrant. She was a Spanish teacher. And when I was growing up in the public school system, I always went to public school. When I was growing up, we, went to a lot of parties and events of the Hispanic Association. Also, my mom, she befriended a lot of people from different nationalities because she related to that experience of being new to the country. And so when I was growing up, I met people from a lot of really different kinds of backgrounds. And I think I understood very early on why integration matters, because it made a difference for my family and people that surrounded us. And this is actually a newspaper clipping of me when I was 4 with my mother. And she decided to do a press article to try to raise awareness about the Hispanic community in North Carolina. And really that experience made me very interested in the larger world. My favorite subject when I was growing up was geography and social studies. And unfortunately, my parents divorced, but that also brought some opportunities as well. And the second understanding for me of what justice means is also about security. And that's because later on when I became a teenager, my mother and my stepfather, they moved to Central America. So they lived in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras. I did my studies in Nicaragua. And my first visit to Central America made such an impression on me. It was a beautiful place. So I'd never seen so many rainbow-colored everything ever. And but at the same time, Guatemala was just coming out of a decades-long civil war. It was only a couple of years after that had seen a genocide as well, the Mayan population. And what I really remember as a kid, because I was only 14 years old, I just remember being very struck by the amount of guns. Very struck. I mean, outside of so many shops and private security guards. And I also had never seen poverty of that scale before. And it really made an impression on me, and it made me realize that freedom from fear is really such a fundamental component of justice. And this then got me very interested in studying human rights, going into the university, and also trying to work on more fair forms of globalization. So the second understanding of human rights for me comes down to equality. So I ended up doing, studying international studies and development in university, and I ended up doing a master's in Geneva in international studies, and my thesis was on the political agency of slum dwellers to affect housing eviction campaigns in globalizing cities. Very it's niche. But that ended up, I ended up getting a job at UN Habitat, the UN agency for urbanization in Kuwait, as an urban studies assistant. And I think, it was very interesting to be in the Middle East, kind of post 9/11 climate. I learned so much. And one of the things that I learned in my advancement of my understanding of justice is that, it was, to me, seeing such a vacuum of formal legal protection for certain groups. So, in 2004, 2005 was the first time that Kuwaiti women could vote. And, there was still a lot of equal rights that they didn't enjoy. But also, when I was there, something that wasn't really talked about globally was how the treatment of migrant workers in the Gulf countries. And that's since changed because of the Qatar World Cup. And there's been a lot of human rights advocacy done on that. But at the time, it really struck me that there wasn't much discussion. And the situation of construction workers, of domestic workers in the Gulf countries with the kafala visa system was really, to me, just unacceptable. And also, and this is much less known, is that Kuwait has a stateless population of Bidun. They're called the Bidun. And they're generations and generations of people who have second-class citizenship. And it really showed me that actually the law can be twisted to be very unjust. And there can be really no justice without equality for everyone in a society. So I went from Kuwait to Spain. And for me, the next word and the broadening of my understanding of justice came down to dignity. And in Spain, I worked at the Center for Economic and Social Rights as a researcher. And this was kind of post-financial crisis. And, economic and social rights are rights like the right to decent standard of living, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to water, food, and sanitation. They're also important, not just civil and political rights. It's economic and social rights also matter. And what we were seeing was that many countries around the world, they were slashing on social spending, cutting pensions, cutting on healthcare, on education. And it was under the understanding that, hey, we have limited resources. We're in times of economic downturn. And we did research on Spain in particular, because these cuts and austerity were leading to severe unemployment. Basically, the youth unemployment rate was over 50%. Pensions being slashed. Just a lot of austerity measures that were affecting people disproportionately living on the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And this was all while there was massive tax evasion. And the cause of the crisis itself had been due to unchecked housing speculation. So really, that led to the birth of what was called the Indignados movement in Spain, which was calling for more accountability on how governments were responding to the financial crisis to ensure human rights. And we did a lot of research on this, and it really made me have a more intricate understanding of the link between human rights enjoyment and dignity and fair macroeconomic and policies, including fiscal policies. So the next part of my own journey was I wanted to continue working in human rights, and for personal circumstances, I ended up in Hong Kong. And I joined a small NGO that was looking for their first advocacy person. They had a bunch of staff attorneys, but they needed someone to be doing the advocacy and campaigns. It was called the Hong Kong Refugee Advice Center at the time. It later became Justice Center Hong Kong. And I was there for 4 years. And it was the first time that I really worked so closely and directly with people who had experienced grave human rights violations, people who were seeking asylum in Hong Kong because of persecution, torture, who had been detained, and then coming here to Hong Kong and losing their sense of identity, being forced into destitution, and I think the most inhumane of all, because of my own upbringing, the inability to integrate here in Hong Kong. And for me, the word is healing because, you know, many of the people that would come through our doors looking for legal assistance, they couldn't even articulate in front of a lawyer what had happened to them because they were so traumatized. They needed psychological support first. And the process of seeking asylum in Hong Kong can take up to decades. And it's very taxing on the clients. And of course, the happiest days for me were, and for the team at the time, were when we would get pictures of the, clients in their countries of resettlement, and they're doing fantastic, working at multinationals, being, taking pilot classes. But the truth is, many of them don't get to be resettled. And this understanding of justice made me realize that justice is a journey, and that it can be hard, it can take a long time, and it's not easy. And so that brings me to where I am today, which is, to me, justice is about resolve. And in early 2017, I wallowed in my misery about the state of affairs, became a misanthrope for a couple of months, and kind of felt sorry for myself. And then I kind of slowly came out of it because I realized that I wanted to be a tiny drop or a tiny ripple in that countercurrent of this turning away from human rights. But in order to do that, we needed to do things a little bit differently than we'd previously done things. We needed to innovate and be creative in the human rights sector as well. And slowly the idea of resolve came to me. And it came to me as well as a result of lots of conversations with people, getting early support from people like Peter in the back of the room, who's now on my board. And Resolve is I won't go into the mission and vision and values, but basically we welcome every year a cohort of 20 promising leaders, and they come from very different walks of life, but all have a common goal for positive social change. And our fellowship last year was on racial equality, and the fellowship this year is on ending gender-based violence. And you can see some pictures of our cohorts last year. Last year we did a campaign on everyday racism as well that was published on social media. And it all sounds really great. And Social Justice Fellowship to me felt like the perfect poetry to describe what it is we wanted to do, like all the key words. But then I would say that to people and I would just get blank stares, because I think in Hong Kong, when you think of an NGO, you think of puppy shelter, elderly home, soup kitchen. And so Social Justice Fellowship is kind of a hard pill to swallow. And also people would ask, well, what do you mean by social justice? And when people ask you that on the spot, it's actually really hard to come up with a definition, even if you work on those issues very closely. And moreover, we didn't really know how the Hong Kong public feels about this term. So we realized we needed to do research and have evidence. And that came about because of a connection I met at CreativeMornings 2 years ago. No joke. So 2 years ago, I met someone who worked at a PR company, Edelman, and we just connected. And they came a year later and said they wanted to help us with pro bono support. And I was saying, we're trying to understand what the public means about social justice. And And they were interested. And actually, they ended up, their intelligence unit ended up doing a survey with 800 people in the public. It's a weighted survey. It was bilingual. So it's weighted to take into account the representation broadly of Hong Kong in terms of education, attainment, income level, age, gender, and geographic location. And we asked people in the Hong Kong public what they, a variety of questions on social justice. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I want to go through some of them with you. But I do want to say that there's power in the room, and I felt that directly, and I'm reporting on something that came about because of Creative Mornings today. So one of the things we asked people was probably the most difficult question to unpack because it's quite philosophical when you think about it. And we decided, instead of asking people like point blank, what is social justice, and trying to get a response, we thought, okay, well, why don't we ask people what their vision of what a socially just society would look like? And why don't we give them some options? And we did a bit of academic reading on different understandings of social justice, and we came up with some things. So this is how people answered. So what you can see is that actually there are areas of broad consensus in society about what is social justice. And the area where there's the most consensus, and again, it's not, this was a representative study, is that everyone can enjoy their basic human rights. 3/4 of the people polled do believe that that is what social justice is about. And also there's a lot of support for this idea that everyone should be free from discrimination and have equal opportunity, no matter your background. Now what you can see is that there is less support on areas of understanding social justice as the idea that people who are more vulnerable in society should receive higher priority, or the idea that society should advance in a sustainable way for the planet and for future generations. So what we kind of took from that was that people's understanding of social justice is still quite individualistic. And it's not so much focused on solidarity and community. This study, though, was done in February. And I do see that some things are changing in terms of solidarity, which I think can be healthy for going forward. We also wanted to know, well, do people care about social justice? Are they indifferent? And so we asked the public, to what extent does the advancement of social justice interest you? And over 80% are interested in social justice. But then we asked them, to what extent does the advancement of social justice concern you personally? And over 2/3 also said yes. But when we asked people, to what extent do you feel you have a responsibility to advance social justice? 16%. So there's a big cognitive gap between the change we wish to see and our role in it. We also asked people, what are the social justice issues that most concern you? And we had a laundry list, as you can see, and we had people tick 3 options. They could also tick other. Good governance, number 1. Areas related to minority rights, a little bit lower. And we also, in the survey, then prompted people, who do you think has the power to affect change? And so we had a huge number of potential actors. I don't have time to show that to you, but for example, on the one about freedom of expression, well, the role of the media and the press was quite high. The only, when we talked about who has the power to make change, we also listed NGOs. The only area where people in the Hong Kong public feel NGOs have power to make change is on elderly rights. So that also maybe tells you something about how people perceive NGOs. And lastly, we asked people, to what extent do you feel you have the ability to make an impact to advance social justice? Now this might at first look a little depressing, but actually I don't think it is. Because what you see is that there's at least 1/3 of the people who feel that they have some ability or great ability to make an impact. And the rule of 1/3 is normally what you need for social change. The thing that I think we'd like to see is that 5%, the area in green, can become larger. But in order for people to feel they can make an impact, they need to have a platform, they need to have skills, resources, inspiration. And so that is how Resolve came about, because we want to change that 5% to be larger. And what we did find, actually, remember I talked about that cognitive gap. We then asked people, to what extent, or what social justice actions have you taken in the last 6 months? And I don't have time to go into all of these, but the truth is that most people are taking action. They're not doing it, it tends to be more at an individual level rather than maybe speaking to decision makers. And there's some unique challenges in Hong Kong in that regard. But people are taking action, but they're not maybe necessarily connecting it to an impact or seeing it as social justice action, or I think possibly worse of all, people aren't taking the time to celebrate the small successes, which is critical. And the last thing I want to say is that, justice can be creative. And that's something that I'm starting to see. And one of the best examples I thought of that recently was this, which was the, in order for people to kind of make a statement on students being detained for having laser pointers or whatever, people decided to go to TST and have a laser point party. It was like a conga line, and people were disco dancing and doing shadow puppetry. It was really hopeful and really creative. And I think what I want to say is that I think when we think of justice, we don't relate to it because we see it as such a big thing. And it is true that with trying to push for justice, the fruits of our labor, we probably won't see in our lifetime. But you can take everyday actions in your everyday world to advance social justice. And you don't need to be a superhero. You can just be an everyday hero. And there's a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt that I always, when I can, show it because I think it just really encapsulates that concept. And she's basically saying that human rights starts at home, and not even at that level. It starts at the community, at your neighborhood level. And that is where you need to, if you want to see change in the larger world, you need to start at that level. And I think the second thing I want to impart is my own understanding of justice is a work in progress. I'm still learning so much. And actually through the fellows that we have in the program, I honestly become more aware of issues as well. And that's true of all of us. Our concept of justice is evolving, and it's a work in motion, and we need to cultivate it. So in order to do that, I think my recommendation and call to action is to broaden your experiences. So if you can go to Chunky Mansions for dinner, do it. If you can sign that 5-minute petition, do it. If you can go to that lunch and learn of the LGBT plus committee in your corporate, go to it. And most importantly, lobby your business to do CSR. And by CSR, I do not mean planting a tree, painting a wall for a day, Instagramming it. I mean dedicating the creative skills to the service of the civil society, marketing, accounting, graphic design. That's exactly what happened 2 years ago today when I had the same call, and that's how we were able to do the survey that I'm showing you today. So thank you very much, and I hope that from here you can have some of those connections.
Okay, we're gonna open it up to Q&A. So anyone want to start off with a question? Well, there's gotta be some questions out there. Right? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you so much for the talk. It's really inspiring, and I think for me it's very moving for this period. So I just want to ask, you mentioned the period of seeking for justice will be tough and will be long. So what is the core value that can drive you go on?
There's one core value that I can think of off the top of my head. This kind of question, it's almost like you want to think of it as an essay almost. And then just one practice maybe. I think the core value is patience and forgiveness as well. Actually, I think generally, and I think there's some, infrastructure where technology is going to. There's a great polarization in society that's being fostered by, different interest groups. And I think this patience and forgiveness is something that we're kind of losing. And actually, it can be a very helpful coping mechanism. And then in terms of practice, I would say self-care is really important. You can't help others until you help yourself. And one way to, I think, especially those of us working in human rights, when you hear self-care, you think of something a little bit like, how should I say, indulgent, like mani-pedi or that kind of thing. But actually, you need to take a break from the work. You need to shut down the social media for a while. And also, the most important mechanism for self-care is to redefine how you see success. Because we think of success as binary a lot of times. And we think of, we want to move from here to here, and it won't happen. So you need to look at how can you, so maybe, looking at the example of the refugee situation, it will be a long time before maybe refugees get residency rights in Hong Kong. And there's a lot of intermediary steps before that. And so if you redefine success, maybe, we help change the food policy so it could be a bit more dignified. When I started at Hong Kong Refugee Advice Center, it was just bags of food, and then we pushed for it to be a coupon system, and we wanted a cash system, and I'm sure that will keep being pushed. But celebrating those small successes, or maybe you just focus on what actions you did take, and having gratitude for taking time for gratitude, taking time for saying, well, today I did speak. Today I came to Creative Mornings. I woke up at 8 a.m. I came here for this talk. I was the first person to ask a question in the group. Those are all things to be kind to yourself about and be proud of yourself for.
You talked about the 20 people that you have every year, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious how you find the people, and I'm a little bit unclear on the role that they play. So what do you do with the contingency of 20 people once you obtain them and work with them?
Yeah. So there's two questions, which I think is on the recruitment, and then also the program and what they go on to do. Maybe three. So on the recruitment, we have a call for applications every year. We're opening up in December. So every year we announce the next fellowship theme on Human Rights Day, December 10th. So I do encourage you to follow us and like us on social media so you can get updated on that. And then a lot of times we do rely on people in the NGO sector. So some people who often get nominated, people can self-apply, but also they can be nominated. And so we rely a lot on word of mouth. Now also we have our alumni who are nominating fellows as well. But a lot of times the NGOs, they'll nominate someone who maybe is a staff member or who is a beneficiary who's been very vocal in maybe some advocacy. Sometimes they're students. I think what makes our program a little bit quirky is in a good way, but also makes it a bit hard to define, is that we don't work with a particular demographic. So we look at criteria. So we look at whether the fellows have a demonstrated commitment to serve, whether they come from different walks of life, whether they have potential to grow but could use more support, whether they're interested in taking action on the fellowship theme, and whether they're positive role models. So for us, the fellows, what they get is they go through a series of workshops and mentoring, and what we want is that the fellows come into the program at point A in their journey, and then they define what their 5-year social justice goal is, and they work towards it so that they exit the program at point B. And then, for example, what our fellows go on to do, some of them have been doing a lot of media articles. So some of them have, radio shows or have been featured in the press. Some of them, we sent to, one of them we sent to Geneva to testify before the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Some of them have gone on to be on government advisory bodies or to speak in legislative council. And some of them have kind of more, community groups and associations, and they're trying to give those more structure and formalize them. On our website, you can see the biographies of our fellows, and I really urge you to look because there's like some really eclectic and very, the same way I told you about my master's thesis, like people who have that very clear vision, and they're interesting reads. And was there a third part of the? I think that was the.
I feel good about what you said.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, Nicole?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Kind of practical question, I guess, but who are some of the people and communities or examples in Hong Kong that you feel like are doing a lot for justice at the moment, and have any examples of things that you can plug into quite easily, so that we can all become more active, I guess.
Yeah. So I'm gonna say maybe one thing on this. One, again, if you go to the bios of the fellows, there's a lot of community initiatives that you can support, and a lot of them work with other NGOs. I think people are very quick to donate to huge NGOs like UNICEF, or not bashing that, but I think people tend to forget that Hong Kong also has needs too, and how rewarding it can be to give back to initiatives where you can actually track the people and see the progress and have a tangible connection to the NGO. I think it's a kind of a reinforcing positive feedback loop where you want to give and give more. Actually, one thing I encourage is the skilled volunteering, not like hard labor one day and then done with it, like continuous volunteering in terms of how you can be useful and, to be honest, what is also most ethical and effective. The other thing I often advocate is that you consider being a regular giver. So most people, they just give one-off donations. And we saw that actually many people in Hong Kong do donate. And Hong Kong is a very wealthy society. So that's a positive thing. I myself, I'm a regular giver to 4 NGOs. And I started off doing this only 2 years ago, and now I can't stop. Every time I see a cause I identify with, I want to support it. So, domestic worker shelters, I donated, or to NGOs doing very geeky scientific research on air pollution, donated. Freedom of the press, donated. And it's like the regular giving, and it's not huge amounts, but that gives NGOs a steady source of income that they can rely on, and it builds a relationship, and you become an ambassador. So that is a key take. I mean, really, that's a key thing for me. And in terms of, so I think that the main thing is try to look at things locally. Start with what you know and what you care about. Those things that I donate to is because I personally care about them. And have a continuous relationship, not one-off. And don't sit and wait for the perfect inspiration and perfect cause, because you'll always procrastinate. Start with something. And I can assure you that empathy is a muscle. So the more you exercise it, the bigger that muscle gets. So I would, start with something and start soon.
Okay.
Yeah, Peter, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, so for Resolve's fundraising perspective, what would be your number one ask? I think you've just mentioned it, but in my case, I kind of, being on the board of Resolve, I understand from a financial point of view, if someone donates $100 one-off, you have no clue whether that's ever coming back. But if someone can break that into $10 per month, then suddenly that builds a foundation which enables a lot of good stuff to happen. So highly encourage, small donations trickling in and making sure Resolve flourishes, and all the fellows. Now that we've got 2 batches of alumni networks, they're all collaborating and doing cool stuff together. The next one will take it to another level. But it'd be great if you can help.
Yeah, and that's exactly where we want to grow. So we have 2 cohorts. We want to bring them together, and we want to have opportunities for the alumni to actually meet each other. and promote more intersectionality of issues. So the connection between, there's people who are connected because they face issues with racial discrimination, but also gender-based violence, and how to foster conversations that examine that more. And we want to continue to provide support to our alumni. So we're looking to grow our alumni network, and that is where our fundraising efforts will be dedicated to in the coming years. And you can talk to Peter afterwards, myself. We also have one mentor here, Zohar, for our cohort this year. So yeah, thank you for that.
Hi, I've been following results on social media, and actually I use a couple of the videos in some of my classes for my students, especially the one of racial discrimination, where one, I think was from Congo, or I don't know, like an African country, a person who couldn't rent a house in Hong Kong, and then he created this all-black football club in Hong Kong where he's integrating people from Hong Kong and ethnic minorities. Do you have any other example about gender violence?
Buenos dias. So one thing that we did do differently from last year the fellows did a group project together, which was the Everyday Racism campaign. This year we're having them actually work on separately, so we're bolstering the mentoring component of the program more. Some of the fellows this year, for example, work on issues with domestic workers, and they want domestic workers to be more aware of how they might be more vulnerable to gender-based violence. So we paired them up with a mentor who's working with the EOC, and their goal is that they want to do more trainings for other domestic workers. There's another fellow who's Zohar is the mentor of, who wants to do more media work of ethnic minority women. She's part of the Wandering Boys, which is a social media platform. So she's kind of bolstering some of her media skills through connections in the fellowship and through some of the training that we're offering. There are a couple of fellows this year who are interested in the intersection of art and human rights. And so some of the fellows do photography or music or graphic design that's aimed at raising awareness on gender-based violence. Or we see a lot of people in this cohort who identify as survivors, and also quite a bit of people from the LGBT plus community that want to raise awareness on those issues. So I think the best thing for us, the best thing is to go to the website, look at the stories of the fellows, and then again, as I mentioned, we actually, through the alumni network, want to help them further that work that I was mentioning. And so, and we want to also be able to communicate it more to the public. So that's why we're trying to put our energies now in developing the alumni program. Thank you for showing those videos in your classes. I hope this is a useful tool.
Last question. Anyone? Everyone's going twice. Okay, cool. Final round of applause. Thank you so much, Victoria.